Hello everybody, welcome to my Redstone video, and today I have an analog clock that I built for both Java and Bedrock Edition, which tracks the in-game time and resets when you sleep. All of the redstone's hidden in your floor, and it takes up about 2 blocks, maybe 3 if you want to count this layer here, but if you're putting this in a build, you probably already have a floor or a ceiling. Anyways, let's get into it. Before I get to any redstone, you should know that there are some quirks with this design. The clock uses copper bulbs instead of redstone lamps. Why? Something quasi-connectivity. Anyway, the other design quirk is that this clock starts the Minecraft day at 8 a.m. when technically it should be 6 a.m. I personally like that. I don't wake up at 6, but that does mean that noon isn't going to be a very high noon. With all that out of the way, if you want to skip straight to the tutorial, there will be a timestamp on screen and in the description. And while you're down there, there should also be a world download. Also at the end, I'll show off some ways to decorate this clock for your build. Right now though, I'll be walking you through the design process. So this all started when I had a random tower like this in my base that I wanted to add a clock face to for decoration. Specifically, I wanted to put my bedroom in the clock room because, come on, who wouldn't? The problem was that existing designs, specifically this one by Joshimu's, took up well over half the tower, which is fine if you don't want an interior, but for me, I'd have to sleep like Harry Potter. So I spent 3 weeks trying to prove I could do better. The first thing I noticed when looking at existing designs for Java Edition was that a lot of space was used just avoiding quasi-connectivity in order to be able to put a redstone block on a piston feed tape. I probably would have never made my own clock if I didn't think to use copper bulbs and 2 observers instead. This worked, but it wasn't without its own issues. First of all, we have 13 blocks in this fist and feed tape, right? But we only want 12 hours. So what do we do here? With a redstone block, we could just power the piston off of the redstone block. And you'd think we could do the same thing with observers, but those only power on one side. And besides, we have 2 observers, so we'd be skipping 2 hours. My next thought was to create a redstone circuit that could detect and skip only the 1 observer, but I never ended up getting the redstone to a point I was happy with. See, I eventually found out that I can use a counter, where I count to 12, one for each hour of the day of course, and align it with the display such that the counter tells the display when it needs to skip that 1 hour to account for the corner. For this, I ended up using this genius counter design I found on Reddit, which, like all the designs I've used, is linked in the description. Also, the way we connect the counter to the display is different depending on whether we're on Java or Bedrock, which I don't fully understand, so if somebody smarter than me does know, I'd appreciate an explanation. It was only at this point that I decided to put the redstone in the floor, and it was for 2 reasons. One, that counter stuck out by 3 blocks, meaning that the clock would be the same size as the design I was trying to beat. Hiding it in the floor was basically me cheating so that I wouldn't be cutting into the space I wanted to use. And 2, whenever something would happen in the redstone, it would sometimes be detected by the observers in the feed tape, creating issues that were both very difficult to identify and design around. By putting the redstone underneath the observers, I wouldn't have to worry about that. Anyway, now that I had a display working, I just had to actually make a clock that resets every morning. The clock part of that wasn't that bad. Like every other design out there, we just use a hopper clock that's configured to go off once every in-game hour. Again, this is a design I found on Reddit. The reset part of that, though, The way we handle the reset circuit is through an RS NOR latch, where one position tells the clock to run as normal, and the other position tells the display to use a different, faster clock to cycle through the remaining hours of the day so that it can reset. That RS NOR latch gets set to the reset position by a daylight detector detecting a new day. To finish resetting, it's a bit more difficult because, as discussed earlier, we can't easily tell what hour the display is showing. Except in this situation, we kinda can because we already have a counter telling us that. We just use the hour skip as our signal to stop resetting, meaning that the clock will stop at 8 a.m., right after the skip. From there, it was really quite simple, right? Right? Well, it turns out my floor is a pretty cramped space, and I ended up doing a lot of playing around with stuff, just trying to get all of the components as small as possible, but most of the stuff that made it in the final design was from Reddit. Even then, most of the 3 weeks this took to make came from trying to position stuff as compact as possible while making sure that nothing was powering stuff it wasn't supposed to. The final positioning looked like this, which you've seen by now, but let's break that down for a minute. Right here is our display and counter. They receive their input at the same point here, so that they should always be in sync. We connect the output of the counter back into the display to be able to skip that 1 hour. We then add in our RS NOR latch right next to the counter's output. At the daylight sensor here, connected to the RS NOR latch, it has to be inverted, so we need a redstone torch too, and the hopper clock here, again, Reddit design. Now, underneath the display, we take a comparator out of the RS NOR latch and use it to power the hoppers in the hopper clock so that it stops when the reset clock is running. Then for the reset clock, it's just a skulk sensor with a minecart or an armor stand on it. Again, I got the idea on Reddit. Then we make this a dispenser with the powdered snow bucket in it to basically slow down the clock, and put an observer here to connect that to the display. When the clock is in the normal mode, the comparator powers this dispenser so that the skulk sensor can't. It would already be powered. And that's it. That was kind of a tutorial already, but let's build it block for block. To start, you'll need to clear out this conveniently tower-shaped footprint 2 blocks underneath your clock face, or just a 6x7x2 rectangle for all you non-tower builders. So to build this clock, you're going to need these resources. First, about half a stack of whatever building block you want. Again, can be any block, just as long as it's not transparent and doesn't interact with redstone, so you can't build it out of observers, for example. 13 copper bulbs. They can be any state you want, so exposed, oxidized, doesn't matter. I'm just using regular ones. 12 buttons, and those kind of go with the copper bulbs, which I'll get to. 4 pistons, 17 observers, 4 droppers, 4 hoppers, 7 comparators, 5 redstone torches, 5 redstone dust, 2 targets, and on Bedrock you only need 1. A daylight detector, which kind of makes sense, a repeater, a redstone lamp, a dispenser, a powdered snow bucket to put in that dispenser, a skulk sensor, water to waterlog that skulk sensor if you want it to be quiet, so you technically don't need it, and an armor stand. Also, if you're on Bedrock Edition, you're going to need an extra 2 repeaters and an extra observer. Now, to build the clock, we're going to start taking some of these items, and first thing we're going to do is put in our display. You're going to want to find this block right here and make a ring of copper bulbs, about like you'd expect on the design over there. I'd also recommend putting buttons on these because a copper bulb, when you power it, it stays powered, and if one accidentally gets powered, you want a way to unpower it. And then you're going to want to put blocks behind these copper bulbs because we're going to have a piston feed tape here, and make sure that this corner has a block in it because we're about to be putting a piston right underneath that. Same goes for these corners here. Make sure you get the direction that they're facing right, because otherwise you'd be going the wrong way, which I'd imagine you don't want to do. And that's all the pistons. Now we want to have observers to power those pistons because they don't just power on themselves. Also, right here, make sure that you're taking an observer out of the piston and not from down here or here, because that can cause issues, as I found. And at this point, we can test this and make sure that the blocks all go around properly. And if that looks good, you can continue to the next step, which is the counter. So we're going to start by putting a dropper here and a hopper in it, and another dropper here and a hopper in it. And then you want to copy this pattern where you have this dropper having a comparator running into this block here, and a comparator out of this hopper here, and then one from this hopper to that hopper, and an observer here. Now, as you might imagine, some of the items are going to go in this, but we're going to get to that at the end. For now, though, you want to put a dropper here and a dropper here, facing into each other right off of this block here. And now we're out of droppers, so I'll just remove this and go grab the next block in the line. And also we can preemptively put a comparator here. And also we're going to have two hoppers here for later. Again, just getting the hoppers out of the way because all four of them have been placed, so that I can get this target here, because we're going to want a target here and a target here. And those will become relevant later. And those were the only two targets. But we're going to want a redstone block here, or redstone dust, sorry. An observer observing that redstone dust, and this here. Now the target is here because we want the redstone dust here to power that piston, and we need a target to direct it to that block so it actually does that. Next up, we can get rid of the rest of our comparators by putting that like that. And this is also where our last copper bulb is going to go. And two redstone torches here. Comparator out of that. And I'm not going to put these two blocks in just yet because I'm going to get the blocks I've used out of my inventory. So this should be all the blocks we have left, which means I can fill up my inventory with these ones. The daylight detector is going to go right here. With a block out of it, redstone dust, and a redstone torch. Now make sure that's an inverted daylight detector. And this redstone lamp is going to go here with a torch out of it. We're also going to want to take an observer out of that lamp and a block right there. And we already have a comparator here. If you don't, make sure you have that, because we're going to be taking a repeater out of it. It doesn't have to have any kind of delay. It's just so that when we put redstone here and here, that it doesn't interfere with this stuff over here. That also means that we're going to put a wool block here. And the block here is just so that this redstone can power this hopper. Same goes with the target. If we didn't have that here, this hopper wouldn't get powered. But I technically don't consider that in the footprint, because if you're building something around this, you're probably going to have a block there already. Now we want this to be a dispenser with a powdered snow bucket in it. And I need to grab some more blocks real quick. So we already went through these ones. And now we're going to grab this, this, and this. Now this is a bit of a tricky part because we want to have wool around here so that the water that we put on this skulk sensor doesn't flow out and destroy components. But it's also a bit tricky because we have an armor stand sitting on top of the skulk sensor, but we can't place it because of this copper bulb here. So we're going to want to temporarily remove that, and then we need to get a piston just as like a temporary thing to push on that so that well, works. So you can do that however you want, as long as this copper bulb ends up here and this armor stand ends up on top of it, powering that, you're good to go. Also, if you think that these two blocks here are cheating, you could just not waterlog the skulk sensor. And there is a way to get around that in Java Edition if you still think that's cheating, which I'll get to later. But we need to take an observer out of this powdered snow, so we wait for the powdered snow to show up, and we put that there. And that should start cycling the display. Now, we're going to want to stop that in a bit by putting items in it, but that should be all of the stuff built. And now we have these two items. Yeah, this is if you're in Bedrock Edition. So this counter will break if you do it like this. So what I say is that you should this server, and then the block here. And what I was saying earlier about that target, technically, you don't need it now because this redstone dust isn't getting directed in any direction, so it's powering in all directions, which is neat. But I'm doing this on Java Edition, so I'm going to put it back how it was so that it actually works at the end. There we go. And now for these items. These are what actually like make the clock work and keep track of time. You're going to want to start by putting a item in here so that this shuts up. Then you're going to want to put one item in either this hopper or this dispenser or dropper, doesn't matter which. And then you're going to want to put 12. So that's 12 total in there. And then the rest of these all go in here. Now, if you notice, these will start moving automatically. If they don't start moving automatically, it's going to be because one of these torches is on when they shouldn't be. So you can fix that by putting a torch, like breaking the torch and putting it back down to power this copper bulb. And you see now items are flowing into here and it's working. And that'll work. But if you notice, we now don't have anything on the display. So that brings us to our last step, which is to see how many items are in here. So 10 items in that one, 2 items in that one. And we're going to use that information to determine where the observers should be. Now, when they are right here, that means that there should be 12 items in this dropper. And from there, it's going to go down each hour. So you have 12 here, 11 here, and then 10 here, which is where we're at. So we're going to put one observer here and one observer behind it. And this is what the buttons are for, so that I can unpower that. And that should keep up, but you're going to want to check this. See, now we have 9. So it would be 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then this corner is technically 0, but it kind of shouldn't be there. So again, make sure that the number, you have one observer here and then an observer behind it. You don't want to put an observer, say, here for only having 2 items in, and then put an observer in front of it, because that will break. Oh, I just broke stuff. Oh well, that's what we have the buttons for. And then if you notice, that should just be the clock done. Also, if your clock is ever not showing anything, it's probably because this observer's in the wrong spot. Same goes if your clock is ever not showing the right time. but this is the one you're more likely to notice. So to fix that, first thing you want to do is remove this block here so that the clock isn't trying to advance the hour while you're trying to fix the hour being in the wrong spot. And then you're going to want to look at this dropper here, see, okay, this has 7 items in it. So we're going to first remove these two and then do what I said earlier where you look 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7. So that's the hour it should be displaying. So we put our observer here and an observer behind it. And then we flick this on. And now we can put this back here. And if I quickly set the tick rate, you'll notice it should do the right thing, yeah? Yep. It skipped that hour, so we didn't see it for very long where the clock wasn't showing anything, which means it worked. And also, I guess now's a good time to show if I get out of bed, jeez, can't spell, and we sleep in it, the clock should reset on its own. So we can see now that it's going, and I'll just set it to 100. We can see it skipped that hour and then it stopped. So about that skulk sensor and armor stand. If you're on Java Edition and you want to move it somewhere else, you can get rid of it and move it to up here. So we're not going to place it in yet because we need to move this dispenser to be facing this way and put the torch back on this side. And we put the observer here, and the skulk sensor goes here, and it powers the dispenser off of quasi-connectivity, which is why it doesn't work in Java, or doesn't work in Bedrock. And then we put blocks around it because we want to waterlog it, and remove it, waterlog it, and I'd recommend putting a minecart on it here instead. So now what we want to do, we can't put a block on top of this minecart, so we need to use a piston to push a block, but thankfully we have one of those right there, so we just do that, and now it works. We've now reached the decoration portion of this video, and I gotta get something off my chest. The tower was never circular. To be fair, I never claimed it was, but it's technically an octagon, and this is what a real circle should look like, at least according to some online generators. Now, I didn't go with a circular tower for 2 reasons. Number one is that you can achieve a much more circular looking tower by rounding off the corners with walls. And in fact, you can take that to a bit of an extreme if you mix in glass panes. And the second reason was that, well, look at this tower. It's technically circular, but from the ground, I'd call that a rounded off square. You don't see very much depth to it, so it doesn't, in my opinion, look very good. Thankfully, I designed this clock so that it can fit in any variation of circle. However, you will notice some holes in here, and that leads me to my next point, which is that some of these blocks have to be solid and some of them have to be transparent. This one here has to be solid so that it can power this hopper, which I went over in the tutorial. Also, this block here has to be transparent so the daylight detector will work. But did you know that this block here is actually a stair, so that this torch doesn't power this piston? Yeah, it gets complicated. The last major examples are both right here. For starters, these corners have to be transparent blocks. Otherwise, an observer that's right here will power the block and power both copper bulbs here and here. The other example is right here, where this block right here is actually a stair, because if it's a solid block, this torch powering on would power through the block and power the copper bulb. The way I personally decorated the clock was like this, which, let me turn the shaders off. We have a very steampunk look here, where this almost looks like a copper pipe here. We have copper grates over the floor so that you can see the redstone. I made this glass for the daylight detector, but you could also just make it a copper grade again. And then in Java Edition, you're able to lower this section of the floor here down by 1 block because we don't have redstone in this area. And that creates a nice little cozy area here. And I have a bunk bed, or not bunk bed, just normal bed up here with this kind of campfire here. So that looks almost like it's powering the clock, or maybe it's an exhaust, who knows. And then chests under here, just to give this area a little bit of use. And this is how that looks on the outside, where, again, shaders off. We have this very basic circular shape here, and then this wooden bit here with trapdoors that covers up the redstone behind it, and also these signs to make it feel like it's kind of a brace for the clock. This one has to be a sign because this observer would power it if it were a trapdoor. You could also just use shelves. And then on the other side, we have about the exact same thing. You can see this one. Can't put a trapdoor here. You could put a sign or a shelf here if you wanted, but then it would be asymmetrical. So I didn't. You could also go for a more realistic style where we have the clock almost looking like a gear, and then it has a log as an axle in the middle, which is connected to some sort of gearbox. I don't know, I tried my best. And that goes down to where the clock's getting its rotational power from, and a set of stairs here for servicing. And then we have the exterior, where the clock has a cloth backdrop on it and wooden supports, and we also move the clock display 1 block forward, and we do that by adding 1 block in between the observer and the copper bulb, where the observer will power the block, and then the block powers the copper bulb. The last thing I want to show off is that there's actually a little bit of space right here where you can put a bed, or maybe put some crafting equipment, or maybe put some chests if you wanted to. Also, if you're on Java Edition, you can replace this redstone with a note block just to make it seem a little bit more enclosed. And you can also climb out pretty easily. Now there's this last little trick I want to show off where you can make a hidden entrance to the clock around the ladder that goes up to it. And to do that, you put this armor stand here, put some trapdoors. They can be acacia or copper is what I'd recommend. You could also just use whatever trapdoors you want, but you put them on both sides and close them up. And then you put a door here. Again, I'd recommend an acacia door because you can see through it slightly better than a copper door, which is relevant because we're going to remove this here and turn this into a grandfather clock. Now, if you want this to integrate slightly better with the roof, you could also put stairs running around the top to connect it up a bit better so you don't see that ladder poking out the top. And just to show it off, you can go in here and climb up pretty easily. You can also close this trapdoor behind you if you really want to, and close the door behind you if you really want to, but you can still get down if you know what you're doing. And that's the end of the video. If you made it this far, it means you probably like this design, and in that case, I'd recommend you show that by hitting the button that YouTube made specifically for that. Because if you don't, somebody's probably going to come along and make a more clickbaity version of this video and get all the views, and we don't want that. Also, if you leave a comment, there's a pretty good chance I'll read it unless there's like 20 million of them. So if you want to recommend something else I should try and build, or if you're having issues with this design, I'll read it, hopefully. Till next time, bye.